Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ingenious Talks Online, heating your home with solar energy without putting panels on your roof. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Laura Kilpatrick, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's event. We'll begin with a few housekeeping items. So this has been set up as a Zoom webinar, which means that all attendee microphones and videos have been automatically disabled. However, you do have the option to ask a question by typing in the Q&A box on your screen. While questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation, we highly encourage you to type them as they come to mind into the Q&A box on your screen. So you do not need to wait until the question and answer period to submit your questions. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible, but please be mindful that with the high volume of submissions, we cannot guarantee that all will be answered. So you may also use the chat box function on your screen to chat amongst each other and share ideas. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted to Carleton's YouTube channel. Finally, a brief survey will appear on screen at the conclusion of the webinar, and if you do have the time to fill it out, we would greatly appreciate that. We really appreciate and welcome your feedback, and all answers are anonymous. Now I'm pleased to introduce to you our speaker, graduate student Sarah Brown. Sarah is currently pursuing her PhD in mechanical engineering at Carleton University as part of the Sustainable Building Energy System Research Group. Her thesis work focuses on replacing conventional sources of energy for space and domestic hot water heating in homes with passive solar energy. Sarah first began working with the Sustainable Building Energy System team during her undergraduate studies in mechanical engineering at Carleton. In addition to her passion for sustainability, she is also a fierce advocate for women and diversity in STEM. Today, Sarah will discuss how to heat your home with solar energy without putting collectors on your roof. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us today. And now I hand it over to you.
All right, thanks, Laura, so much for that lovely introduction. And yeah, thanks everybody for coming and spending your lunch hour with me and talking about my research. So as Laura said, I'm a PhD student in the Sustainable Building Energy Systems Research Group at Carleton under the supervision of Professor Ian Beausoleil Morrison. I've had a long-standing interest in sustainability and specifically solar energy. I was a member of the Solar Powered Car Club in my elementary school. I pursued a co-op placement with Minto's sustainability team, and I worked as an undergraduate research assistant within this at the Urbandale Center for Home Energy Research during my undergrad to learn more about how we can use solar energy in our homes. So this is something that I'm very passionate about, and I'm always happy to talk to people about how they can use passive solar energy in their homes. So let's talk about how you can heat your home with solar energy without putting collectors on your roof. Okay, so before we get into how you can heat your house with solar energy, maybe we should start with the question, why? Why should I care about making use of solar energy in my home? Well, let's look at where we use solar energy in our homes in Canada. Just under 82% of residential energy use is actually attributed to space heating and domestic hot water heating, so DHW heating. We can see that in this middle figure where the orange portion shows us that 64% of our energy use in our homes goes towards space heating and 18% goes towards domestic hot water. And we actually supply our space heating and domestic hot water heating primarily using GHG or greenhouse gas emitting energy sources. So mostly natural gas, as you can see with these side pie charts. So for space heating, we actually we supply space heating with over 50% natural gas. And for domestic hot water in Canada, we're supplying our domestic hot water heating with 70% natural gas. So a lot of greenhouse gas emitting sources. Thankfully, in Canada, most of our electricity is actually generated from non-greenhouse gas emitting sources. So electricity is pretty, clean in Canada. So when we're looking at appliances, lighting, space cooling, which are all electricity dominated end use categories, those ones are pretty good. So domestic hot water heating and space heating are just really good places for us to be targeting the electricity to be targeting our efforts in reducing the residential sector's greenhouse gas emissions. If we also look a little bit further into this, 55% of the Canadian residential building stock is actually single detached homes. But these single detached homes account for a disproportionate amount of the residential greenhouse gas emissions due to their increased space heating requirements. So over on this left-hand pie chart, we can see that, yeah, 55% of the building stock, but 73% of the residential greenhouse gas emissions are attributed to these single detached homes. So again, specifically focusing on reducing the active space heating demands in single family detached homes will have a significant impact on Canada's greenhouse gas reduction. So what about solar energy? Most of the time when people think about using solar energy in their homes, they think about PV panels. So like these pictures that I have on the left. Most neighborhoods will have at least one house that's making use of electrical energy harnessed by PV collectors. This is actually the house in the middle here. I passed on a bike ride recently, and they actually even have PV panels on their shed, which you can see right here. So PVs are really convenient because you can use the collected energy for plug loads, cooling loads, heating loads, basically anything in your house. But they do have lower efficiencies because a lot of the solar energy gets absorbed as heat and the panel performance decreases as the cell temperature increases. So those are the PV panels, which are what people are most likely thinking of when they think of solar energy in residential. A less common method of harnessing solar energy is using what we call thermal collectors, and that's what I have pictured here on the right. So thermal collectors are actually what's installed on the Urbandale Center for Home Energy Research, which is located on Carleton's campus. And I'll talk a little bit more about this facility later because it's where I do my research. But just to picture the picture here with the collectors on the roof. So solar thermal collectors are really an interesting option for heating dominated climates since you can get higher efficiencies and directly collect the thermal energy. So again, directly collect that thermal energy and use it to supply heating demands in the house. So domestic hot water and space heating. So a really interesting option for Canada where we're heating dominated in our end uses. So Curtis Meister, who's one of my colleagues in the Sustainable Building Energy Systems Research Group, found in his research that solar thermal systems have the potential to meet over 90% of the space heating and domestic hot water heating demands in energy efficient single family detached homes in Canada. So really like a lot of potential in this more unconventional collector option. So both technologies have their challenges, storage being a major one, cost is often another often talked about challenge, but these are what we call active solar collection systems. And if they're designed properly, they can allow the same level of control for heating as conventional systems. But the title of this presentation specifically says that you will not need to put collectors on your roof to heat with solar energy. So, what's the deal with that? What's the solution? Passive solar energy is a third and I think often forgotten contender in solar energy. So when people ask me about the potential of passive solar energy, when I tell them about my research, I always get people to think about that room in their house that has a big window and gets really hot on sunny days, or even to think about their car and how hot that can get after sitting in the sun for a few hours. These are both examples of passive solar heating. So for me, that room that has a big window and gets lots of sun and gets pretty hot is my bedroom. And I've actually pictured that here for you guys. I love this room. My plants love this room. My cats love it for sleeping. This is actually the room where I'll also often take my video calls since I get the best internet there. And I'll often close the door to keep my cats out because they'll harass me during my meetings. And by the end of an afternoon meeting, I'm often sweating because this room gets really hot. So I did a little test last Thursday in preparation for this talk. It was a sunny day. I don't know if any of you guys remember. Beautiful day, sunny day. And I put a thermometer in my room and I recorded the temperature every 30 minutes. So on the right of this slide, I've plotted some of the weather data from last Thursday. So the blue line shows the outdoor air temperature. Again, not sure if anybody remembers, but last Thursday was kind of our first day of nice summer weather. The day started at about under 10 degrees, but it reached over 20 degrees by the end of the day. I've also plotted GHI and DHI, which are measures of solar irradiance. GHI is the global horizontal irradiance, and DHI is the diffuse horizontal irradiance. I'll refer them as GHI and DHI for the rest of the presentation. The solar energy that we receive has two components. There's a beam or a direct component and a diffuse component. So GHI is the sum of the combination of the beam and the diffuse components. So it's basically this total solar that we receive. And DHI is the diffuse component. So on a sunny day with a clear sky, we'll have high values of GHI and low levels of DHI. So indicating that there's a lot of beam irradiance. on cloudy days, we'll have high levels of DHI that actually end up overlapping with the GHI because the diffuse component is basically the total irradiance. So as you can see here, we have a lot of GHI, not a lot of DHI. So last Thursday was a nice, hot, sunny day. And so I'm going to say, considering that I live in an old, leaky house, my window here is west facing, and it's actually double pane. And I mean, given this picture, it's a little bit dirty. And I kept my bedroom door closed during this test with no mechanical heating or cooling. So just passive solar heating. My question for you guys is, how hot do you, if my room started at about 19.5 degrees at 10 o'clock, what temperature do you think it was by 6 o'clock? So this is about 8 hours, and sunset is about 7:40, just to give you guys some clarification. All right, so you should see a poll, I think, if you guys want to submit your answers there. All right, so here are the results. So most people thinking that we got it up to 27 degrees. Definitely most people thinking we got it above 25. So just to, oops, go back to my slides. So yeah, my room actually got up as high as 29 degrees Celsius by 6 o'clock. After 6 o'clock, I went for a nice bike ride because it was so lovely out. So I didn't continue the test past that. But I imagine this was probably the peak temperature because after 6, we're heading towards sunset and the solar gains would be starting to come back down. So on the right here, I've actually plotted the temperature measurements that I took, and I've overlaid it with the passive solar gains that I've calculated to be coming through my window, given my window area and the orientation. So the orange line is basically the rate of energy added to my room by solar gains in watts. So I've put a dotted line, a vertical dotted line, where the indoor air temperature really starts to spike in my room. So remember, this is a west-facing window, so I'll get most of my solar gains in the afternoon in this room. Again, sun rises in the east, sets in the west. So you can see in this graph that the spike in the indoor air temperature actually corresponds to the same time as the passive solar gains start to increase in magnitude, which makes sense. We're getting more energy into the space through by passive solar gains, so the temperature really starts to peak up. And just to give you guys to put the heating potential of this passive solar into perspective, a high performing personal space heater, which some of you might have been using working from home this past winter, puts out about between 375 to 750 watts. So the passive solar gains that I received into my room on this day were comparable to me basically going and turning on this little space heater in my room at 10 o'clock in the morning, closing the door and leaving it on until 6 p.m. And we even got more than 750 watts between 3:30 and 6 o'clock. So even more than just the space heater. All right, so let's talk a bit more about passive solar energy. So why should we make use of it in our homes in Canada? Let's start by looking at this figure that I have here, which is the GHI, so the total solar irradiance for a winter day, February 8th, 2020, which is the blue line, and a summer day in July 6th, 2020, which is the yellow line. So this is in Ottawa, measured data from Ottawa. As you can see, the total solar irradiance that we receive on the winter day is significantly less than what we received on the summer day. This probably isn't surprising to many of you living in Canada who have probably noticed that the sun, feels stronger in the summer than it does in the winter. So my question for you this time is, will I get more passive solar in February, so in winter, or in the summer in July? And just to give you guys an idea, I have the average irradiance posted at the bottom. So the average irradiance in July in the summer was about 2.5 times higher than it was in the winter time. So again, we'll give you guys a couple of seconds to put in your answers for the poll. All right, so pretty split answers here. And I was wondering if some of you guys would maybe not pick the obvious one, just for that assuming that it wouldn't be the obvious answer. But so if you didn't pick the obvious answer, then you were correct. We actually get, on average, more than 3 times more passive solar on a sunny day in February than we do on a sunny day in July. So again, the total solar irradiance that we're getting is higher in the summer, but the passive solar energy that we get into our houses is higher in the winter. So Southern Canada is actually a really good place for passive solar heating. We receive lots of solar gains in the winter, and we're a heating-dominated climate. So the time of year when we need heating lines up really nicely to the time of year when we get a lot of passive solar gains. And as you can see here, I think we're about 3 times higher passive solar gains in the winter than we are in the summer. And so just a little bit about solar angles. My professor always, solar angles always tend to be a bit confusing. And my supervisor always says when you're trying to figure out solar angles, it's good to just get a globe and then get an object that you act as the sun and to work your way around the globe to really understand it. So I've tried to portray it here in schematic form for you. But basically this correlation between our peak passive solar and our peak heating demands has a lot to do with the Earth being tilted at an angle of 23.5 degrees from its orbital plane, which I've shown in the schematic here. So again, we're not perfectly straight on with the sun. We're actually angled a little bit. And this tilt is why our days are actually longer in the summer in the northern hemisphere and shorter in the winter. So you can see on this left-hand globe, which I've represented as a summer solstice, the northern hemisphere is in the irradiated area longer. And in the summer or in the winter time, we're in the irradiated area shorter, which means we have shorter days in the winter and longer days in the summer. And Ottawa sits at about a latitude of about 45 degrees north. So if you look at this schematic that I have, you can get an appreciation for how the angle at which the sun irradiates our homes changes between the winter and the summer. The reason we get our maximum passive solar in the winter and minimum in the summer is due to our latitude in the northern hemisphere and the low solar altitude that we get here in the winter. So the low solar altitude in the winter, or if you want to think about it, the sun, looking lower in the sky around noon in the winter versus the summer, results in the beam component of the solar irradiance being in line with our windows. Whereas in the summer, the sun is higher and the beam component hits our roofs a lot more. So over the next year, I encourage you guys to keep an eye on the sun patch that's made by any south-facing windows in your home. You'll notice in the summer that the sun patch is pretty small and sits close to the window, but in the winter, it'll actually extend much further into your room. So you'll end up with a much bigger sun patch. And this is due to the lower solar angle that we have in the wintertime. All right, so now let's start to talk about my research in a little bit more detail. So we've now established that passive solar heating has potential and is a good heating option for Southern Canada. So let's talk about my research specifically. So I don't actually do my research in my bedroom, taking measurement data with a little thermometer. That was just for fun. I do all my research at the Urbandale Center for Home Energy Research, which we also call the Cheer House, and I'll be referring to it as that for the rest of the presentation. So the Cheer House is a research facility that you may have seen as you passed by Carleton's campus and thought very curiously, what is this little red solar house on a hill? So let's just run quickly through some of Cheer's construction features. So it's built as an average size single family detached home that's typical of Canada. So about 6 by 12 meter footprint, full height unconditioned basement and 2 above ground conditioned floors. The house is of wood frame construction, built with more insulation than what's required by current building code, but built using common construction practices. So again, you could give our specs to any contractor and they should be able to build it. The house is also very airtight. So we've purposely designed it to be airtight to minimize any energy losses through air infiltration. And the windows are triple pane argon filled windows with low emissivity coatings. So these windows are basically designed to allow as much passive solar heating as possible into the house while minimizing energy losses through the windows. To maximize the potential for passive solar heating, Cheer has most of its windows on the south facade. So we have about 20 square meters of south-facing windows on the south side, and we have minimal window area on the east and west facade. So about 2.5 meters squared only on the east and west. And we have no windows on the north facade. So I've also included here some pictures of the main floor and the basement of the house. So we're certainly not interior designers. The house doesn't have any fancy finishes, purposely done so because we're basically always screwing sensors and attaching sensors to things. So no sense in putting any pretty wallpaper up. But throughout the house, you can see we have a lot of sensors installed. So on this main floor picture, you can see that we have a sensor that's in the window that's actually measuring the passive solar gains that are coming in through the south-facing windows. You can actually also see a couple of our shielded indoor air temperature sensors, which are these little shiny things in the middle. So those are giving us accurate measurements of the indoor air temperature. In the basement, you can see basically a lot of piping and mechanical equipment, and a lot of this was actually installed by graduate students. There are many different thesis projects installed at the Cheer House, and we have a vast hydronic system that lets us switch between these projects really quickly. So another really prominent feature of the cheer house is the radiant floor. So we have 110 meters squared of low mass radiant floor installed on the 2 above ground stories of cheer. So the 2 kind of living areas of cheer. We have purposely designed these floors to be low mass and to have the pipes close to the surface so we can minimize the thermal lag between when we turn the floors on and when they start having an impact on the air temperature. So for air-based systems, or air-based HVAC systems, which I imagine most of you are familiar with if you have a home in Canada, when you need heat, your furnace basically turns on and starts delivering hot air to the house. And this has a pretty immediate impact on the air temperature of your house. In comparison, the heat from the water, in comparison, the thermal response of radiant floor heating and cooling systems is delayed from its on time. So the heat from the water that's running through the pipes needs to then heat up the floor construction around it, which then allows you to heat up the surface of the floor. And then that surface will start convecting heat into the room and also radiate energy to the other surfaces to heat them up so that they can start convecting heat into the room as well. So again, there's a bit of a time delay between when you start sending hot water to the floors and when you actually start having an impact on the indoor air temperature. So radiant floors are designed, some radiant floors are designed to have high thermal mass, but we have purposely designed our radiant floor to be low thermal mass so that we can minimize the time lag between turning on the floors and having an impact on the air temperature. All right, so let's see if people have a better time guessing the temperature in the cheer house than they did for my bedroom. So I've put the weather data for January 28th, 2019 on this slide. So again, high GHI values, low DHI values. This is a sunny day, but it was much colder than last Thursday. This is again, January 28th. So we're dealing with outdoor air temperatures that are fluctuating around minus 20 degrees Celsius instead of plus 20 degrees Celsius like we saw last Thursday. So on this day, and we were mechanically heating the cheer house at night, but no cooling was offered during the day. So we're dealing with something to notice here is that we're dealing with a lower window to floor area ratio. So I forgot to mention this when I was presenting on my bedroom, but my bedroom had about a 24% west facing window to floor ratio. So now we're dealing with a 13.5 window to floor area ratio, but we're dealing with south facing windows now, which should receive more passive solar. But we're also dealing with a mainly south-facing windows and also a better constructed house than mine. So my poll for you is if cheer started at 22 degrees at about 8 o'clock in the morning, what is the maximum temperature that you think we reached on this January 28th day? So again, it's minus 20 out, so keep in mind that it's a lot colder. And yeah, we're just gonna give you a few seconds to get into that poll and submit your answers. All right, so there are the poll results. So a lot of people thinking, most people thinking we got up to 28 degrees, some thinking as high as 34, but mainly fluctuating between 26 and 30 degrees. So we were actually able to get cheer up to 32 degrees on this day. So minus 20 degrees outside, and we're still able to heat up the house to 32 degrees just with passive solar energy, which is, it's quite amazing. And I was pretty shocked when I first saw this. But that's evidently too hot. Nobody would want to live in a house that's 32 degrees during the day. And overheating is actually a really common issue that's discussed in passive solar heating research. Occupant comfort studies have determined that, overheating, which is, there's not actually a consensus in occupant comfort, but generally people agree that it's temperatures over 25 or 26 degrees Celsius. So we really want to be keeping the temperature in cheer below that threshold. So obviously it's cold outside. So we could have just, on this January 28th day, it's cold outside. So we could have just opened some windows and cooled off the house that way, right? Let in some of that minus 20 air. But we in the Sustainable Building Energy Research Group thought that just venting out all of that solar energy that had been collected seemed like, an awful waste. So instead of just opening the windows and venting out all of that hot air, we've developed a system that lets us make the most of the passive solar energy while avoiding overheating. All right, so here's a schematic of what we call the Pisces system. And this is the system that we've designed to help us capture the passive solar energy without having overheating. So Pisces essentially stands for the Passive Solar Collection Energy System. And I give credit to my professor who's always able to come up with really nice acronyms for very mouthy or wordy names for systems. So the Pisces system is depicted here. The system makes use of hot and cold thermal storages. So in this case, we use water storage, the radiant floors that are installed at cheer, and a water-to-water heat pump. So the way it works is that when we need cooling in the house, we can send cold water to the radiant floors. And this cold water removes excess energy from the conditioned spaces, thereby preventing overheating. So cold water leaves this cold storage tank, starts to go through the radiant floors, and it heats up as it extracts energy from the conditioned space. So this warmed water is then returned to the cold storage, and this process continues as long as you need cooling. But something to think about is that if we didn't do anything to this cold tank, again, we just continued sending water to the floors, kept heating up that water, and then kept bringing it back, eventually the cold storage tank during this time would just heat up and we wouldn't be able to cool anymore because the tank would be at too hot a temperature. So we use a water-to-water heat pump to basically move energy from the cold storage tank over to the hot storage tanks. So this keeps the water in the cold storage tank cold and lets us store collected energy in other tanks where we can make use of it. We can make use of the collected energy for things like domestic hot water during the day, or even space heating at night. And we're not even restricted just to nighttime space heating demands. If the sunny days in the winter are followed by cloudy days where there isn't enough passive solar heating during the day, we can use the stored thermal energy where we had too much of it on a sunny day and resupply it to the spaces via the radiant floors. So the Pisces system essentially lets us collect passive solar energy when it's not needed or there's too much of it, store it, and then resupply it for domestic hot water heating and for space heating when you don't have, or when sufficient passive solar gains aren't available. So I'm going to spend the rest of this presentation talking about some of the results that I got from experiments that I ran in February 2019. So in February 2019, the Pisces system was supplying both the space heating and cooling demands for the chair house. This slide actually shows how I operated the radiant floor during this time. So the radiant floor heating turned on when either the first story or the second story dropped below 19.5 degrees Celsius. So when either of the floors dropped below this temperature threshold, we would turn the radiant floor heating on until both of the floors were above 20.5 degrees Celsius. So basically a 1 degree temperature band. And similar thing on the radiant floor cooling side. The radiant floor cooling turned on when either of the first or second stories got above 23.5 degrees Celsius. And it stayed on until both of the floors had cooled below 22.5 degrees Celsius. So again, about a 1 degree temperature dead band that we're working with there. And to give you all an idea of how we supply space heating domestic hot water heating demands, we basically have three 450 liter hot water tanks, as well as a seasonal storage system that we use to store passive solar energy that's collected by the Pisces system. So in 2019, we were running some short-term tests on the Pisces system. So the seasonal storage system was not at a hot enough temperature to be able to supply heating demands. So we were really limited to the energy that we could store in the 3 hot water tanks for supplying space heating and domestic hot water heating. 2 of the tanks we reserved for space heating demands, and the 3rd tank is reserved exclusively for domestic hot water heating demands, which I've shown here. And we would basically exclusively use stored thermal energy to supply space heating and domestic hot water heating until the tanks drop below the radiant floor supply temperature of 30 degrees Celsius. So once the tanks drop below that supply temperature, they needed a little bit of extra help to be able to meet heating demands. So once the tanks are below 30 degrees, which is what we want to send to the floor, we would turn an inline electric boiler on to help basically add some energy to boost the temperatures up to 30 degrees Celsius to meet space heating demands. So anytime that we're supplying space heating demands with this boiler running, we're not using entirely stored thermal energy. We're also using some electric energy. So this is kind of what we would call our unmet demands. All right, so let's look at some data now. So we're going to be looking first at some data from February 9th and February 10th, 2019. So here's the weather data for February 9th and from midnight on February 9th to sunrise on February 10th. So again, high GHI values, low DHI values. So again, a really sunny day, and the outdoor air temperature fluctuated between -7 and -15. So pretty cold and very sunny. So I have another poll for you guys. Do you think that we were able to keep the cheer house below its 23.5 degree cooling set point with the Pisces system running? So again, remember without any cooling in the cheer house on January 28th, that cold day in January, we were able to get the house up to 32 degrees. So now I'm asking you, okay, well, we have this radiant floor cooling system running. Do you think we were able to keep the house temperature below 23.5 on this day while running the radiant floor cooling? And I think we're going to have a poll come up. There we go. Perfect. So throw in your answers and we'll see who gets it right. I don't have any prizes, but you can give yourself a pat on the back if you get it right. All right, we have our results. Yes, I love all the enthusiasm. I love all of your belief in my Pisces system. Unfortunately, though, we were not able to keep it below the 23.5 degrees Celsius set point. So we weren't able to keep it below the set point, but the house did actually heat up to almost 26 degrees Celsius, even with the radiant floor cooling running. So we're going to look at why this happened by looking at the major heat transfer paths into cheer on this day. So let's imagine the condition zones in cheer as boxes. When the Pisces system is operating, the main heat transfer paths that we have are the passive solar gains that are coming in through the windows. So these are adding energy to the space. And then we have the radiant floor heating and cooling, the heat addition and the heat extraction. So these aren't all of the heat transfer paths. Obviously, the building is still going to be losing energy through its building envelope, but these are the main ones that we can measure at the cheer house. In engineering, we use Q to represent heat transfers. So we have the heat added by the passive solar gain here, the heat added by the radiant floor, and then also the heat that's removed by the radiant floor cooling system. And if we do, so I don't know if any of my thermo students are in the audience here, but we're going to do basically an energy balance on these rooms. So obviously the radiant floor heating and cooling can't be on at the same time. They use the same piping network. So when one is operating, the other has a value of 0. So if we sum up the energy that's added by the passive solar gains, and then the energy that's either added or removed by the radiant floor at every time measurement time, we can see if the net energy, if we have a net energy addition or a net energy removal from the conditioned spaces. So again, if we sum up this Q passive solar, so the energy added to the space by solar gains, the energy added to the space by the floor heating, or the energy removed by floor cooling, if we add those things up, if the value, the sum of those three things is greater than 0, then we have a net energy addition to the space. And if you're adding energy to your house, then your temperature is going to be increasing. If the sum of these three things is less than 0, well, then we have a net energy out of our system, which is going to result in a decrease in temperature. All right, so don't be intimidated by these graphs. I'm going to walk you guys through them. So on the left here, we have, basically I've plotted the major energy path, or the major energy transfers plotted. The Q floor cool, which is this blue line here, is actually an energy extraction. So it's actually a negative heat transfer with respect to the floor because we're pulling energy out of the space. I've depicted it here on the positive axis so that it's easy to compare with the passive solar gains. So let's start with this figure on the left. So starting over on the left-hand side, when we have these black dots on top of the pink ones, so pink being the floor heating, black ones being the boiler operating. So when the black dots are over top of the pink dots, that basically means that the boiler was supplying some of the space heating demands at the time. So as we can see, in the morning on February 9th, the boiler was supplying the space heating demands, which means that we didn't have sufficient stored passive solar energy to meet these space heating demands on its own. So the boiler was doing most of the work here. Looking at the graph on the right, we can see the impact that the radiant floor heating has on room temperature. So the red line that I've plotted here is that sum of the passive solar, the radiant floor heating, and the radiant floor cooling that I was talking about in the last slide. So that's this sum here. So the red line is representing that sum. And so if the red line is positive, that means that we have a net energy addition to the cheer house. And if the red line is negative, that means we have a net energy loss from the cheer house. So between midnight and sunrise, there are no passive solar gains because it's dark, and the radiant floor cooling isn't running. So the red line is 0 other than when the radiant floor heating is turned on. The blue dots on this graph represent the indoor air temperature change between subsequent 5-minute periods. So if the blue dots are positive, this means that the house is heating up. And if the blue dots are negative, this means that the house is actually cooling down. So when the radiant floor cooling isn't running, so like if we started at midnight here, when the radiant floor cooling or the radiant floor heating isn't running in the early hours of February 9th, we can see that the house is actually cooling off. So we have these negative blue dots. And this is because it's cold outside and the house is going to be losing energy to the environment. When the radiant floor heating turns on, so this red line becomes positive, we can see we have a corresponding spike in the blue dots to the positive axis, which means that the house heats up when the radiant floor heating is turning on. And then when the radiant floor heating turns off, we drop back to decreasing in temperature. And then the radiant floor heating turns back on, we're back to increasing the temperature of the house. So now when the sun starts to rise, that's when things start to get interesting here. So just after 6 o'clock, so looking now over on the left at this yellow line, when just after 6 o'clock, we can now see that the passive solar gains start coming in into the house. This causes the red line to start to increase. So again, we're having a net energy into our space through passive solar gains. And we also have a corresponding increase in the temperature. So again, these blue dots move to the positive axis, saying that the house is actually heating up. And this passive solar gains cause the house to heat up pretty quickly. We're moving at about 0.1 to 0.15 degrees every 5 minutes. So pretty quickly heating up when the passive solar gains start coming in. So just after 9 o'clock, we reach the air cooling set point of 23.5 degrees Celsius, and the radiant floor cooling turns on. So you can see that where this blue line comes in to save the day, hopefully. So the radiant floor cooling turns on, but unfortunately, the rate at which the radiant floor cooling can extract energy is lower than the rate at which we're receiving passive solar gains. So again, look at this graph on the left. You can see that the blue line has a lower rate of heat transfer than the yellow line. So we're extracting less from the space than we're gaining through passive solar gains. As a result, this red line stays positive because we still have a net energy addition to the space. And the blue dots also stay positive. So the house is still heating up, but we can see that we're heating up at a much lower rate than we were before the radiant floor heating the radiant floor cooling turned on. So this radiant floor cooling stays on for a really long time. It stays on for 5 hours, about 5 hours of operation before the passive solar gains decrease below the rate at which the floors can extract energy. So at this point, when the passive solar gains drop down below the rate at which we're removing energy, you can see that this red line becomes negative and the house starts to cool off. So since we ran the radiant floor cooling during the day, we were able to extract and store a ton of energy. And this stored using the Pisces system, and this stored thermal energy allowed us to be able to supply these first 2 heating loads at night using exclusively stored thermal energy. So notice that these first 2 pink spikes on the left don't have any black dots on top of them. So this means that the heating demands were entirely supplied using stored thermal energy. It's not shown here, but we were also able to supply 50% of the domestic hot water demands on this day, and we were able to add energy to the seasonal storage. So again, we were able to take that excess energy and then put it towards useful means. So we weren't able to decrease the temperature in cheer immediately. So again, we hit 23.5 degrees and then we just kind of kept going up. So we weren't able to decrease the temperature immediately when we turned the radiant floor cooling on, but we were able to significantly curb the rate at which the temperature was increasing. So if you look at this graph on the indoor air temperature on the left, you can see the place where we turn the radiant floor cooling on, because the rate at which the indoor air temperature is increasing gets curbed down a little bit, right? So instead of shooting up to 32 degrees, we only go up to about 26 degrees, which is much more reasonable from an occupant comfort perspective. Again, people are much more likely to be happy with a 26-degree house than they are with a 32-degree house. And on top of keeping the house at a reasonable temperature, we were able to put excess solar energy towards other useful heating demands instead of just venting it out of the house through the windows. I'm just going to check on my time here really quick. Okay, it looks like we're running out of time pretty quickly. So I'm just going to I had another day that I wanted to show you guys, but maybe I'll just kind of go through it really quickly. So this is another day where I was running the Pisces system for heating and cooling. So this is data for February 5th and 6th. And this is kind of what we would, if the weatherman's telling you that we have a mix of sun and cloud today, this is kind of what we expect the weather data to look like. So the DHI, the diffuse, is overlaid with the GHI in the morning, meaning there was a lot of cloud cover, but in the afternoon, the GHI and the DHI separate showing periods of clear sky. And the outdoor air temperature was pretty high in the morning, but it dropped a little bit lower in the evening, so to -10. So for the last poll of the presentation, I'm going to ask you guys, do you think we were able to keep the indoor air temperature below the 23.5 degree set point on this day? So last and final poll to see if you're the almighty knower of the Pisces system. All right, yes, thank you everybody for having confidence in this. So most of you said yes, and you're pretty much right. I mean, we got up to 23.8, slightly above our set point, but I attribute a lot of this to the thermal lag between when we turn the system on at the set point when it starts to have an impact on the indoor air temperature. So I'm just going to quickly show this graph, which is the heat transfer graph. And the most important thing to see is that we were when we turned the radiant floor cooling on in the afternoon, the solar gains were already on a decline at that point. So, but by the time we turned on the radiant floor cooling, its extraction rate was higher than the rate at which we were receiving energy through passive solar gains. So again, if we look at that sum over here, the red line on the right, we had passive solar gains in the morning, so the red line's positive, and then as soon as we turn the radiant floor cooling on, that red line drops down to a negative value, showing that we're having a net energy extraction from the building, and we have a corresponding decrease in temperature. So these blue lines drop down to negative. So we're basically able to have an immediate impact, a near immediate impact on the indoor air temperature, keeping the house much closer to its set point. But because we ran the radiant floor cooling for a shorter period of time on this day than we did on the last day, we were only able to supply a portion of the first heating demand with entirely stored thermal energy. So again, still relying pretty heavily on the boiler here, but we were able to supply all of the daytime space heating with passive solar gains and then a portion of the active space heating at night. So again, just and this is just again showing that we were able to keep it pretty close to the set point, just slightly surpassing. And again, I'm attributing that to the thermal lag of the radiant floor. So again, main conclusions, what do we take away from this talk? Passive solar heating has a huge potential in southern Canada, so much so that overheating to 32 degrees Celsius is a risk, even in the winter. We can significantly decrease the maximum temperature in the cheer house by running the Pisces system without needing to restrict the passive solar gains or vent this energy to the house. We aren't always able to keep the house below set point, but I'm working now on optimizing the system operation to better address this. And the other conclusion is that we're able to collect excess passive solar energy, store it, and then use it for heating demands in the future. So like these space heating demands that we saw on the sunny day. There's lots of work to be done on this system, but in the coming years of my PhD, but the preliminary results are looking really promising, and we're really excited to be investigating the system more in the future. So if you're not specifically interested in the work I'm doing, my research group, the Sustainable Building Energy Systems group, which is under this little red hexagon over here. So we're part of a greater building performance research collective at Carleton called the Building Performance Research Center, or the BPRC. The BPRC is composed of 6 professors researching a variety of topics from novel mechanical systems, occupant comfort, building data analytics, smart building controls, community level energy, and tiny homes even. So I encourage you guys to look into the research portfolios of these other research groups if you're interested. Some references. And yeah, I went over my time a little bit, so I'm hoping we still have time to answer all of your burning questions. But here's my contact information if you can't stick around and you do have some questions for me.
Thank you, Sarah. Great presentation, lots of fabulous information that you shared there. For everyone that's in attendance, so Sarah's LinkedIn as well as the website she's mentioned have been posted into the chat, so if you want to take a look at those. But let's move on to our Q&A section. Lots of questions here. Our first one, so it references your January 28th experiment. So during the January 28th experiment, when the building reached 32 degrees Celsius, what was the impact of internal heat loads in the building from lighting, equipment in standby, plug loads, etc.?
So yeah, great question. So as this question asks, or questioner asked, the heating gains to this house aren't exclusively the radiant floor and the passive solar gains. We also have internal gains. And so for those of you guys who aren't familiar with building terminology, internal gains are basically anything inside your house that's going to be producing heat as well. So we have, ovens, your computers put off a lot of energy. You yourself, if you're doing an at-home workout or even just sitting at your desk, you're putting off a lot of energy as well to your space. And so, yeah, these aren't or these have an impact on adding heat to your space, which could also cause, contribute to the heating factor in the house. So we actually don't have a lot of internal gains in the space. And so during my experiment, the cheer house is unoccupied, and we only have a few computers running, and the lighting is mostly LED, so pretty low lighting requirements. So the internal gains are really low in this house, and it's something that we're looking to investigate in the future, is having a piece of equipment that runs through internal gain schedules that other researchers have collected to see, okay, well, what impact does a typical internal gain profile have on our temperature fluctuations and then the performance of the house as well? Because again, as you can see, if we had internal gains on top of this, well, we'd be heating up even more. And so that does play an impact on this system. So it is something that we're hoping to look at in the future. It's not something that we've exactly quantified at this point, but yeah, definitely something that we're looking into, and to be aware of that internal gains are an added heat gain to the space in an actual house where this could potentially be installed.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, next question. Your house is completely exposed on all sides. There are no trees, bushes, or neighbors. Hopefully that is not a realistic situation. How do you take that into account?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously shading has a big impact on your ability to collect passive solar gains, right? So again, like this this questioner asked, we don't have any shading on our windows. We have no neighbors. We're really lucky. We're kind of secluded on the north side of campus, which is really good for solar energy. So yeah, this isn't something that I'm particularly taking into account, because again, we don't have neighbors or anything that to work with. But it's something that we could consider by, restricting the window area and seeing, okay, well, what happens if we have a lower window or lower passive solar gains by restricting the passive solar gains using external shading. So it's something that we're looking into is, okay, well, is the 20 square meters too much window area for the heating demands of this house, right? Like, or is this not realistic? Should we go with a smaller window area? But we're starting with the maximum potential, because we want to say, okay, well, if we could design a house to be completely exposed, have this full window area, and then really make use of this passive solar energy, are we able to supply all of the heating demands for the year? Should we be making more of an effort to have these exposed sides in our building designs and in our community designs? But it is something that you could look at, is restricting the passive solar gains and seeing, okay, well, how much heating do we have now? And that's something that we could definitely look at. I'm starting right now with the maximum possible to then be able to reduce down and say, okay, is there a smaller number that makes more sense? But if you had shading and things like that, it would just mean that your incoming passive solar would be lower, which isn't necessarily a bad thing in this case, because as you can see, we're still getting pretty hot on some days. So it's all about scaling the mechanical system to match what you're getting in through passive solar gains. So if you had a smaller passive solar or smaller window area, you were receiving lower passive solar gains, you'd be wanting to scale your storage and your mechanical system to match that, really.
All right, next question. I live in a small semi-detached house in the city with a black flat roof that I assume absorbs a lot of heat from the sun. Years ago, I was told that the roof is too small for solar panels. Has this changed?
Yeah, so I will preface this by saying solar panels are not my area of expertise. I do mention them as a contrast to my option, which is passive solar, again, through windows. And I will point you towards my research group does do research into thermal collectors, and so you can definitely look towards them. But yeah, I mean, any amount of, you saw in this, I wonder if I can share it back. Oops. Give me a second to share my screen again. All right, so looking back at this PV slide that I had here, I mean, you can see this house has PVs mounted on their shed, and I'm assuming your house is bigger than the shed. So I mean, too small a window area really, or too small a roof area really isn't. I don't think a fair argument in this case. Again, these building owners were able to really make use of all the roof area, including their shed. So I think it's really just the more area you have, the more you can make use of this technology, and the more collectors you can put, so the more energy you're going to harness. So yeah, I really think too small a roof area isn't necessarily the issue. If you can put even one panel, you're going to be able to collect some energy with that.
All right, next question. Has there been any consideration of incorporating the ventilation system into the Pisces control system to help maintain comfort while still collecting passive solar?
Yeah, so I'm assuming here that you're talking about incorporating like air exchange and dehumidification potentially, and those are definitely things that need to be considered with the passive or with the Pisces system. So with, I mean, radiant floor cooling, we're obviously only having sensible cooling and not any latent cooling. So there is the potential for humidity buildups during humid times, and condensation on the floor is actually a really a common problem that people have with radiant floor cooling. So we would definitely be, again, implementing this in somebody's home or in future iterations, looking at incorporating a separate dehumidification system. And we actually do run an ERV separately from the Pisces system. So these things are still incorporated into the house, but they run completely separately from the Pisces system. So my research is focused on primarily pretty exclusively controlling the radiant floor heating and cooling, potentially looking into dehumidification later in my PhD. But yeah, otherwise the ventilation runs separate from the radiant system.
Right, next up, do you consider Pisces to be more suitable for new builds or existing homes?
Yeah, so that's another big question. So again, if you think about the components that make up the Pisces system, it's a radiant floor, the heat pump, and then thermal storage. So, and then, I mean, window area, obviously. So definitely, and I think if there are any, contractors on this call, everybody will say things are always easier the first time around. It's always easier to install something in a new build when you have the time to plan for it, and it's, ripping things up to then put it in. But people install windows all the time in retrofits. People install radiant floors in renovations. They're extensive renovations, but they are possible. And then, so that's the radiant floor and the windows. And then you're just looking at having a heat pump and thermal storage. So at the Cheer House, we have basically hot water tanks and cold water tanks in the basement that act as what we call our daily or diurnal storage. And then we also have the seasonal storage system. So seasonal storage system would definitely be easier to incorporate into a new build. And we've designed the seasonal storage systems that are installed at Cheer to actually be worked into new building designs. Because again, when you're building a house, you often excavate the area under a basement and then you fill it back in the area under a garage, and then you fill it back in afterwards. And our theory is, well, you could just throw a seasonal storage system in there and make use of that while in this hole that you've already dug. So again, seasonal storage is definitely easier to implement in a new build, but I'm a firm believer that this could be definitely implemented into a retrofit building. Again, increasing your window area on the south facade, installing a radiant floor, you would just then need to look at, okay, well, what's your thermal storage capacity given the space that you have, and then scaling your system. So again, scaling the window area depending on how much energy you can actually store in the basement or store in thermal storage at the house. So I think it's applicable to both, but I would definitely say always easier to implement in a new build than in a retrofit.
Perfect, thank you so much. So the last question I think we have time for is, does the system allow for lag? i.e., does the cooling system come on before the set point?
So yeah, so as you saw maybe in the presentation, the set point is set at 23.5 degrees, and we often surpass that just because, again, when the house reaches 23.5 degrees, that's when we turn on the radiant floor cooling. And as we mentioned, we've designed this to be a low mass radiant floor so that it's as quick responding as possible, but there is still a thermal lag associated with radiant systems. So something that I'm actually investigating right now, and I'm going to be investigating in the next year of my experimental work at the Cheer House, is actually the use of predictive controls. So predictive controls, which is for looking at weather forecasts, predicting how the indoor air temperature is going to fluctuate over the day, and then making decisions on your mechanical system to be able to manage your set point. So not overheat, not underheat. And yeah, so basically looking at predictive controls, which will turn the radiant system on before we reach the set point in an attempt to not overshoot the set points. So that's something that I'm going to be looking at actually in the next year, and I'm hoping to have some papers out on that in the coming year. So yeah, keep an eye on my LinkedIn and keep an eye on our website, and hopefully when those publications come out, you'll be able to read them. But it's definitely something that we're looking at, because the Pisces system and radiant systems in general really do benefit from more advanced control schemes than just on-off reactive systems.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sarah. What a fabulous presentation. And I hope that everyone gains some valuable insight and information. And yeah, thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
So you're just going to see a brief poll appear on your screen. If you do have the time to fill it out, that would be greatly appreciated. And so all answers are anonymous. So our next Ingenious Talks online event will be on May 5th from 12 to 1 p.m. So to all alumni and individuals on our Ingenious Talks mailing list, please keep an eye out in your inbox for the invitation in the coming weeks. Thanks again to Sarah, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. Keep well and stay connected, and hope to see you all again very soon. Have a great rest of your day.